there. I'm Chris-Rachael, your Kitchen Overlord, back for day 6 of my South by Southwest challenge to make a video a day for an entire week. Going pretty well so far. I, of course, have chosen to make my videos about food from the Shire because I wrote an Unexpected Cookbook, the unofficial book of Hobbit Cookery, and because of all of my research, I've learned more than a few things. In fact, things that I could not fit into the book. It's 30,000 words, there's even more. Because man, if you love Tolkien, once you go down a research rabbit hole, you are not going to come up for a while. He wrote so much else and so much really interesting stuff. And when you learn about the historical context that a lot of this stuff is in, I find it just amazing, and I feel that it really enriches my personal reading of The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings, and I hope it will help you guys as well. So, we're up to meal 6. That means supper. Supper is almost the same joke as the afternoon tea, if you go back and watch that video. Because, and I feel like he included supper and dinner as your 7 Hobbit meals for the exact same reason that he included breakfast and second breakfast, because that was just crazy talk. Nobody's having 2 big, hearty, full meals at the end of the day. The reason I'm saying nobody's doing that, not because of social strictures today of overeating or anything, but because at the time that he was writing The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings, you had World War I, and man, poor guy. Literally all but one of his friends died in World War I. We forget how incredibly brutal it is. So between World War I, the interwar period, and World War II, all of England was suffering massive amounts of food shortages, and that's why they started food rationing for World War II, because people starved to death in World War I and the interwar period because there just wasn't enough food to go around, and they wanted to make sure that not only were the soldiers healthy, but that everybody back home still had enough to eat. And the only way to do that was to ration it. So there was no way at the time that he was writing this and the time that it was coming out and new and people were reading it, that anybody would have been able to have 2 big meals at the end of the day, just like they wouldn't have been able to have 2 breakfasts. It's as big a fantasy as a world with hobbits and elves as far as they're concerned. I find things like that really touching. Like he's doing a lot of this out of just straight up love. Now, another thing to keep in mind about supper and dinner as far as a contrast is concerned is if you want to start a knockdown, drag-out fight that isn't about politics or religion, ask people what they call the last hot meal of the day that they eat, and then pick the other one and defend it. You will get people riled up. Let's be honest. Whether you call your last meal of the day supper or dinner, it's 100% of regionalism. I realize that right now in comments on YouTube, people are going to be wanting to fight me about this. Like I said, it's one of those things that gets people riled up. But it's been that way for over 100 years. At the time when Tolkien was writing, some of his readers would have called it supper, some would have called it dinner. The fact that he's including both is in some ways inclusive, but mostly it's a nod to the fact that, none of us really have enough to eat. I've decided, for the sake of, trying to decide what goes in each Hobbit meal, what makes each one distinctive, that supper would be a meal that you could make a little faster than dinner. Dinner, your last meal of the day by the Hobbit hierarchy. I picture as being like slow food, something that these days you would put into a crock pot or a Dutch oven that's got to simmer or cook really, really slowly for 8 or 10 hours just so it gets tender enough to eat. Supper, on the other hand, maybe you don't have enough money to make those slow foods, or maybe you just need something a little bit faster, and that's where supper would come in. Now, your main course at supper is not going to be a whole lot of meats. Your main course at something like supper is going to be a cobbler. Now, these days, cobbler tends to mean, at least in the US, some sort of fruit dish that has been topped with a crumble topping that's mostly just flour mixed with butter and maybe some spices. Cobbler meant something totally different in the 1890s, the time he based the Shire upon. At that point, the reason they called it a cobbler was because if you were poor enough that you couldn't afford a full pastry crust to cover the top of your big communal meat pie, which everybody was eating big communal pies back then you would cover it with cobbles, which is you roll everything out nice and thin, you press them out with a cookie cutter, and then you lay those kind of on top of one another so it looks either like street cobbles or like roof cobbles, and that gives it a very pretty effect while also stretching out your ingredients. A lot of these things are all about stretching out poverty food. Now let's say you don't have an oven, because most of you probably wouldn't have if you were an actual villager at that point in time, but you still want to make a dinner. Or supper in this particular case, what are you going to do? You take a bunch of leftovers from before, and I know I've mentioned leftovers in all of these videos. I cannot stress enough just how much leftovers they ate. Remember the big 3-foot handled skillet that I mentioned back in the breakfast video. If you've got a roaring fireplace that's not only providing your heat for your home, but also the only thing you have available to cook on, you shove your 3-foot-long cast iron skillet in there. And the reason that you've got the 3-foot-long handle on that is because otherwise you are literally going to burn holes in all of your clothes. It's so hot and it's spitting ashes at you. You will send your eyebrows off if you come too close. If you've never worked on one of these things, and most people, thank God, haven't, they are brutal to try and cook on. So you shove your cast iron skillet in there, you get it nice and hot, you pull it out, you've already cut up your carrots and potatoes and turnips. These things have been pre-boiled, as we mentioned in a previous video. And whatever meat that you have, mix it up with a little bit of broth and some flour to make a gravy. Put that in at the base of your skillet, and then you top it with the cobbles. If this sounds like a kind of modest meal, it's because it is. Then you shove it back into your fire, leave it there until the bottom stuff has cooked through, or warmed up really, and the biscuits are cooked through, and you pull it out, and suddenly you have what you're probably going to have for your second to last, if you're a Hobbit, last if you're someone living this era, a hot meal of the day. Now, the thing about the meat in something like this, a cobbler was not only a way to stretch out your cheaper ingredients, it's also definitely a way to stretch out your more expensive ingredients. Most people would only have meat once a week, like that Sunday roast chicken that I mentioned before. That's probably going to be your only meat for a lot of families. If you are wealthy enough to have more meat, it might be 4 to 6 ounces to split between your whole family, and families were pretty big back then. So what you're going to do is you're going to get something on the bone if you can, so that you can get some free broth by boiling the bone and marrow and everything down. You're going to use that as the base of your gravy that you're putting into the cobbler, and you're going to cut it into a bunch of small pieces. Everybody in your family might literally get 1 or 2 bites of meat as part of this, and be grateful for it. Make sure dad got a couple of pieces of meat, make sure mom got a couple pieces of meat. The kids are going to have to kind of pick around and fight over it, depending on their level of manners and whatnot. And that's it. That's all the meat you've got, and it's probably only the second time this week that you've even had meat. It's so incredibly expensive back then. I hope this gives you a little bit more context about what real world meals would have been like. We're going to wrap it up tomorrow with our last meal of the day, dinner. I'm going to be a little bit more lighthearted with that one, a little bit less grim reality of poverty food, and hope that these have been educational for you.